Our first presentation today is by Professor Jeffrey J. Kripal. Professor Kripal is the Associate Dean of the Faculty and Graduate Programs in the School of the Humanities and the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. He is also the Associate Director of the Center for Theory and Research and the Chair of the Board at the SLN Institute in Big Sur, California. Jeff is the author of 8 books, including most recently, The Flip, Who You Really Are and Why It Matters, Penguin 2020. In this book, he envisions the future centrality and urgency of the humanities in conversation with the history of science, the philosophy of mind, and our shared ethical, political, and ecological challenges. He is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal currents in the sciences, modern esoteric literature, and the hidden history of science fiction for the University of Chicago Press, collectively entitled The Super Story, Science Fiction and Some Emergent Mythologies. There he intuits and writes out a new emerging spectrum of superhumanities in both senses of that expression. His full body of work can be seen at jeffreyjkripal.com. Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you here. The word is yours.
Great. So as Bernardo just explained in that little bio, I actually work in the humanities. I'm not a scientist. I'm most concerned about the humanities and how they might contribute to this conversation. I happen to think the sciences are the major contributor to our modern worldview, and that the humanities need to engage with them on an even and fair table. I want to begin with just a very brief story because I want to emphasize that my thinking around these topics is not abstract or purely theoretical. It comes out of human interactions. It comes from human beings. Most of all, it comes from letters I receive for things I write. This letter came last winter before the pandemic, and I'll just call this man John. John wrote me a story about a really profound auditory dream that he had one night around midnight, in which he heard a very violent car crash. He woke up, immediately went to his window. Nothing was there. The next night, he had the exact same auditory dream at the exact same time. This time he went to the window, and there was, in fact, a car crash below his window in which a human being perished. John wrote me this email really mostly because of my writings on precognition and theorizing what time and space might actually be given these really common human experiences. So I just want to begin with that, and I want to emphasize that what I have to say is really based on these interactions. So by training, I'm a historian of religions. The history of religions is a particular lineage at the University of Chicago that was begun by a man named Mircea Eliade. And it really, what it basically is at heart is a comparative study of extreme or exotic states of consciousness coded in cultural forms. These cultural forms might be architecture, they might be painting, they might be scriptural texts, they might be ritual, music, myth, fiction, any number of things. But what religion is essentially a cultural coding of these extreme or exotic states of consciousness. I also want to emphasize that when I look at these experiences, what I think I'm really looking at are human beings' experience with the real, with the really real, which is then coded in the imagination, but also sometimes results in what I will call special effects in the physical environment. And this is really where I come up against my own field. Religion and the humanities tends to be seen strongly as a purely subjective affair. It's something in the head. It's a set of illusions. It's a set of delusions, really. Um, but that's actually not what you see when you look at the history of religions. You see often physical effects in the physical environment that correspond perfectly to some subjective state of mind or visionary experience. So I like to think of religion as a kind of science fiction movie that individuals find themselves in. And I like to think of these so-called miracles as the special effects of these science fiction movies. One definition of religion I really like is from a sociologist named Martin Riesbrodt, who's no longer with us. Riesbrodt was a German sociologist, taught both in Europe and the States. And he defined religion very simply as a complex of practices that are based on the premise of the existence of superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal, that are generally invisible. Riesbrodt went on to essentially argue that what religion attempts to do is what he calls make contact with these superhuman powers, which are potentials that slumber, as he put it, in human beings. He also described religion as what he called a legitimate form of science fiction, which hooks up nicely with what I'm trying to say here. As I've thought about this approach to the history of religions, this approach to extraordinary or exotic human experiences vis-a-vis the modern sciences, I've tried to communicate with a much broader audience that's not trained in the study of religion or the sciences, and I've tried to simplify things into what I call the 3 bars. And these are 3 bars that I would like us to at least to attempt to get over. Most of my colleagues, I should say, don't even get over the first bar, but I suspect those of us in this room here probably are over or interested in all 3 bars. The first bar comes down to the question of whether these extraordinary things happen. Do people like John actually dream the future or not? Is that a subjective illusion, just a dream, just a coincidence, or was John actually tapping into the actual nature of the future space-time matrix, as it were, and hearing or seeing something real? Put differently, this first bar asks the question, why do people believe impossible things? Which I think is what most secular critics wonder about religion. My answer to that is that people believe impossible things because impossible things happen all the time. And they happen to people. And by the impossible here, I do not mean, of course, literally the impossible. I think the impossible is strictly a function of our worldview. What is impossible or possible is completely relative to a particular worldview and what it considers to be possible or impossible. And I think in our modern secular world, we've taken all sorts of things off the table that happen all the time so that we can preserve and argue for the plausibility of our own particular secular worldview, which happens to be scientistic and materialistic and mechanistic in orientation. So to kind of capture this idea, I often say that our conclusions are a function of our exclusions. If you look at the history of science carefully, what you realize at some point is that science never really explained paranormal phenomena. They basically just set them to the side or rejected them. And today you get a whole series of what are essentially rhetorical devices to keep these things off the table. And I'm trying to put them back on the table. The second bar comes down to the question, if these things happen, what can they tell us about the nature of consciousness as such? If something like John's dream of the future actually happens, does that tell us something about the nature of mind and its relationship to the natural world? That's either a yes or a no. I think, again, that my own sense here is that John's dream was about the future, about a future that already existed, already had happened in the future, and that this tells us something about the nature of mind or consciousness, that it's probably not entirely limited to the present moment. The third bar, I think, is the hardest for us to get over, but it's probably not too hard to think about. The third bar comes down to the question, what can these extraordinary experiences tell us about the nature of the physical cosmos? Can extraordinary experiences like John's tell us something about the nature of space-time that, say, a mathematical formalism can't speak to? This is a question that grates against our entire order of knowledge as it's set up in the universities today. Our universities depend on a pretty clear binarism between subjective or soft humanities, which essentially are studying nothing at all, because states of mind are considered epiphenomenal. They're considered essentially illusions that have no basis in reality. They can be reduced in toto to material processes in the brain. And on the other side, there are the objective, or what we call hard sciences. These are the disciplines of knowledge that study the material world and so study what really is, i.e., matter. What these extraordinary states suggest is that that's a false binarism, that there's something about consciousness that can tap into the structure of the cosmos and tell us something very real and very important about it. So those are my three bars. Again, bar one, do these things happen? Bar two, do these things tell us something about the nature of consciousness or subjectivity? Bar three, do these things tell us something about the physical cosmos? Just to kind of give you a very simple, not simple, but very singular example of what I'm trying to get at, Paul Marshall here in a book called The Shape of the Soul articulates all three bars in almost iconic fashion. The language of the three bars is not Paul's, it's mine. But the subtitle of Paul's book captures all three bars. What mystical experience, these are these extraordinary things that happen, tell us about ourselves, the nature of consciousness and reality, i.e. the cosmos. And Paul's fascinating. He's a Cambridge-trained, scientifically savvy humanist who had a profound mystical experience as a young man about the spherical nature of the soul and of reality itself, and then develops out of that a very elaborate metaphysical system involving Leibniz and Einstein and Darwin and contemporary parapsychology. So this is the kind of thing I'm pointing toward. It bears obvious comparisons with ancient Indian Jainism, which also saw the soul as spherical, and Mahayana Buddhism, which is very similar to Paul's vision in its sense of these interconnected monads. But that's not my point. My point isn't that ancient Jainism or Mahayana Buddhism or Paul Marshall have it right. My point is that this is a new way of doing knowledge, combining profound subjective experiences with really rigorous scientific, philosophical, and historical methods. I often talk about what I call the future of knowledge. The future of knowledge is essentially a refusal to separate subjectivity and objectivity in any absolute way. I believe that the ideal of objectivity, as it's commonly talked about, is a half-truth, literally. I also believe that subjectivity, as we commonly talk about it, is also a half-truth. And that below both of these forms of knowledge, which have split in the human brain and the human person into these different disciplines, there's some more basic unus mundus or unitary world. So essentially, if you want to put a label on me, I'm a dual aspect monist. I think that the world is one, but I think that it splits up epistemically in the human being into two dimensions, a material dimension out there and a mental dimension in here, neither of which actually exist as such. Most recently, as Bernardo hinted at in his introduction, I've been writing about what I call the superhumanities. The superhumanities are essentially an attempt to return to what I think the humanities have always been at heart. They've been at heart a series of ideas and systems of thought that are based on the extraordinary or exotic states of consciousness of very gifted human beings, some of which, by the way, have been idealists. Idealism, which I take it is part of our conversation here, is rooted historically in Europe in people like Hegel, Schopenhauer, and in some sense Nietzsche. And Hegel and Schopenhauer were fascinated by what we today call paranormal or parapsychological phenomena. They considered them to be very real, and they considered their idealist metaphysics to be the best model or argument for these kinds of experiences. Nietzsche is also really important here. He's often seen as the origin point of what we call postmodernism and a lot of forms of relativism and deconstructionism. But in fact, he was arguing against this kind of nihilism and this kind of relativism. And he was writing about what he called the Übermensch, which translates literally into the superhuman, which he claimed to know and to see. So essentially what I mean by the superhuman is this accessing of these altered states, not just in these 19th century German figures, but also in more modern and global figures, I suppose, like William James, who spent most of his life doing psychical research. W.E.B. Du Bois, his African-American student who really founded, in some sense, critical race theory and also used all kinds of tropes from psychical research, like the fourth dimension and the veil and the word soul itself. Like Jacques Derrida, who ended his life fascinated with telepathy and telepathic phenomena, which he believed were the ultimate forms of deconstruction, since they deconstructed the nature of subjectivity or the individual person itself. Or Gloria Anzaldúa, the post-colonial Chicana lesbian critic, grew up in South Texas here, spent her life in Santa Cruz, and based a lot of her post-colonial theory on her own altered states, which she framed through the categories of neo-shamanism. I'm working on a book on this now. It has 3 parts: how we came to be super, how we came to be human, and how we might now become superhuman. How we became super is the history of religions. The history of religions is filled with states of consciousness and mind that can easily be described as super. How we became human describes the last 300 or 400 years, mostly of Western European thought, in which these states of the super were fundamentally rejected, and the human being became more and more historical, more and more material, more and more mechanistic. And now how we might become superhuman is not by denying either one of those histories, but by putting them together and integrating them into some future form. Finally, I'm going to close with a joke. It's actually for Don Hoffman. Don, you write a lot about the matrix in your work, this notion that reality is essentially a virtual reality display. It's an old story, as we know, that goes back to Plato's cave and runs through all of mystical literature. The superhumanities I'm putting on the table here certainly works from the same kind of sensibility that reality ain't what it seems to be, but it does not reject or try to push away reason or science or the traditional humanities. It tries to do both. And so, as we know, if you've seen the movie, you know that there's this famous scene where Morpheus offers Neo a red pill or a blue pill. If you take the red pill, you will be ushered out of the matrix and you will see reality as it is. If you take the blue pill, you go back to sleep, essentially. You continue your dream and reality continues as it were. So this is the super and the human in my categories. So here's the joke, and here's what I think the superhumanities are really about. It's about taking both pills at once and seeing what happens.
You, and I already knew this, it's not only from today's presentation, you make a strong association between religion and this extraordinary phenomena. And I know that this is not what you're saying, but some could interpret it as saying that the role of religion or the meaning of religion are these above ordinary events or experiences, while the ordinary is kind of banal and fully understood. And this is a little pet peeve of mine. I don't like to make this concession to our present-day cultural prejudices. I think the ordinary is profoundly mysterious. The concreteness of matter is just the surface of a whole of mystery that has no end. We are surrounded by the mystery. So my question to you would be, do you see also a role for religious thought and religious experience, a religious way of relating to reality in the modern world, even when we are talking only about the ordinary, not the superordinary?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I know you think that because of your own idealist experiences and convictions. My relationship to religion is a contested one. And I think it's contested in this field of the study of religion as well. Most people who study religion, nobody grows up saying, I'm going to become a professor of religion, right? What essentially happens is they grow up in a religious tradition, they encounter some question, often of a moral or gender or sexual or racial nature, and it can't be asked, much less answered in the tradition. And so they back into the study of religion, and they have a very contentious relationship to religion, which essentially creates all kinds of human suffering, but also carries these memories of these super states. And so religion it's a kind of double-edged sword. It constitutes these memories of our superhumanity, but it also solidifies these memories into dogmatic, ritual, and mythical and institutional systems that end up excluding people in some fashion. And so I'm just conflicted about your question, Bernardo. It's sort of like when people ask me, what is your relationship to your Roman Catholicism? And I always say, oh, that's easy. It's tortured. It's not easy. And I think the bigger question here is, what do we say to our parents? Or what do we say to our families? Or what do we say to people who live in non-academic cultures? How do we communicate what it is we think about, say, religion in this case? And I think that's a really big question, and I don't have an easy answer for that, Bernardo. I think there is a relationship. I think there is a way to relate religiously to what you're trying to get at, but I don't think that form of religion or that style of religion is common. I think it's very rare, actually. And it certainly has trouble taking on institutional forms and preserving itself. So it tends to appear in individuals and then disappears with their deaths. And I think so there's this problem of how to carry on this and how to create an institution or a culture out of this orientation that simply doesn't exist yet in any kind of institutional or cultural form.
Yeah, I've got a question. How important is the paranormal to your worldview? It seems to me, well, I'll just say, for me personally, it's kind of a stumbling block. You and I, there are a lot of overlaps between our worldviews when it comes to acknowledging the importance of subjectivity and even of mystical states. But there's something I find sort of tawdry about the whole realm of paranormal research at this point. There's so much fraud involved. You know, there have been people who have made honest attempts to find evidence for ESP and precognition and things like that. And there just isn't any really convincing evidence. The true believers remain true believers, skeptics remain skeptics. So I guess I'm asking you, how strong is your commitment to that to the paranormal as part of your overall view of superhumanities?
So, very important and not important at all, depending on how you want to look at it, John. I mean, I think the paranormal is just a modern, fancy word for what we earlier would have called magic or miracle. And magic and miracle are really, really central to the history of religions. If you remove them, you remove religion. So I actually think it's really, really important, but I'm not attached to the word paranormal. I mean, we can talk about when it was coined and why it was coined and the intellectuals who coined it, but it's the phenomena themselves that I think are so incredibly important. And the reason is it's not because you can force these into a scientific method. I don't think you can, John. And I think that's where we agree. I'm very, very suspicious about scientific attempts to study paranormal phenomena. I think you're using the wrong method. But to those individuals who have these experiences, these are the most important experiences of their lives. And so to dismiss them is essentially to dismiss people's lives and to dismiss meaning. And I just think that's a real mistake. And I think also my own field, the study of religion, it really was born in the 19th century by essentially rejecting miracle, in this case in the Gospels and biblical criticism. And so it really develops as a rejection of the miraculous or the marvelous or the magical. And these are all different categories, by the way. I'm not buying into the theology behind the miracle or the theology behind magic, frankly. I'm just saying these kinds of belief systems are based on actual human experiences. And if our goal is to understand the human experience, which is my goal, may not be the goal of other people, but it is my goal, then you better darn well take these experiences seriously and centrally, because I just don't know how else to make sense of religion. But I agree with your assessment. Of course, you're right about what your assessment of things. But I suspect this has always been a pretty tawdry and dubious enterprise. Religion is, when people joke about parapsychology and how it's linked to politics or military or money or whatever it's linked to, I'm just like, sounds like religion to me. I mean, it's just always been that way, and I don't see a way out of that. I see a way into it, but not a way out of it.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you for that very, very stimulating presentation. I'm wondering how you respond to the secularist challenge that religions are so varied in humanity. And if we're looking for truth, how could there be truth across the board when the religions are so incredibly diverse? How do you respond to that?
No, of course, that's the $64,000 question. And the way I respond to that is I say, really, I don't even study religion. I study proto-religion, which are these extraordinary experiences that then get picked up in different cultural and historical contexts and get fed into institutions and rituals and myths and scriptures, and they become very different worldviews that actually are different and cannot be equated. But at their base, there are these extraordinary human experiences. And this goes back to John's question, actually. One of the things that has really shocked me over the years, and by the way, I wasn't trained to look at these phenomena. I was trained to look at male sexual orientation and mystical literature. I had zero interest in what we call the paranormal. I came to this very late because of human beings, not because of any theoretical interest on my part. And what struck me so much in the past, say 15 years, is how incredibly common these experiences are across all cultural and historical boundaries. I mean, you can find, I can show you shaking chains and rattling noises symbolizing death in a 7th century Chinese Buddhist text or in a 19th century Victorian novel. And I see zero difference. Now, does that mean the Gothic imagination and medieval Chinese Mahayana Buddhism are the same? No, they did completely different things with those things. But there's some basic human experience underneath both of those that I think is basically the same. And that's total heresy, by the way, in my own field. And I think that's where you might be coming from is, the humanities in the last 40 years have fetishized difference, and they have demonized sameness. And I think that's why we're at where we're at. I mean, I think that's part of the crisis now, is we have no way of articulating how we're the same or how we're similar. We have all these very sophisticated ways of how we're articulating how we're different, but not how we're similar. And again, this is where the sciences, I think, can really help, because they just make no sense if all you're talking about is difference. They're really talking about a similarity or a sameness across cultural and historical boundaries.
We may have time for one more quick question. Don?
Yes. So as a scientist, I don't believe any of the scientific theories. I just take our best scientific theories as the best ideas we've got so far. And my goal as a scientist is to break them quickly, to find out what's wrong with special relativity, to find out what's wrong with quantum theory, to find out what's wrong with evolution by natural selection. That's what we try to do in science. We study these tools because of the best we've got so far, but if we were just happy and stuck with them, we would never make progress. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see that kind of spirit possibly happening in the humanities, in terms of there's lots of experiences, but then we tell stories about those experiences. How do we move through the stories and get better and better stories that are more powerful, and get rid of the ideas that were not so good?
Right. So, Don, the way I frame that is through a question: can science make us better mystics? And what I mean by that is, can the kind of science you just articulated kind of act as a honing in on reality? Can we use our experiences and this sort of this skepticism or constant deconstruction of the sciences to hone in on what is real? And that's actually what I'm trying to do now at the Superstory project, is show how the sciences have fundamentally shifted or changed the religious imagination, and people are no longer talking about their extraordinary experiences in terms of medieval theology or some other world. They're talking about them in terms of hyperdimensionality and neuroscience and evolutionary biology and quantum physics and on and on and on. And we can criticize that, but I think we also have to understand how understandable that is and how it might actually be positive. And just one more thing to go back to John's comment. Why am I so interested in the paranormal? Because the paranormal is essentially destabilizing. If you really look at these experiences and how they function in a life or a culture, what you'll see over and over again is that they essentially destabilize the worldview. And they push the person, or sometimes the whole culture, into another worldview. And so that's why I like them. I like them because they provoke. They don't fit in. And so I share your sensibility completely in the humanities, but humanists unfortunately do believe science, Don. They do. They believe it. And they believe old science. They're kind of stuck in this 19th century materialism. And any invocation of, say, quantum physics, they just look at us as new age woo-woo. And they don't understand that it was the quantum physicists who first made this connection to mystical literature. It wasn't the New Age. It wasn't the counterculture. It was the physicists themselves. So they're stuck, and they really believe. So I'm just trying to sit there with them and say, don't believe your beliefs. Don't think your thoughts. But that's a tough message.